You all good, Zach?
Hi, yeah, I think so. You mind if I practice sharing my screen here? One thing I'm curious about is how that works.
So Sean is the host.
Oh, okay.
Sean, are you there?
I am, and Zach, you are a panelist, so you should be able to share your screen. Do you not have the function?
So when I click on it, it says host disabled participant screen sharing. So maybe there's a setting that has to be.
Okay, try it now.
Yes, that seems to work.
Beautiful.
Okay, so let's see. So what I'm going to see if I can do this in presenter mode and tell me if it. Are you seeing just the slides or the whole thing?
I am seeing your. I'm seeing presenter view, so I'm
okay.
The slide deck is down below. So you if you go to slideshow, is it going to? If you run the slideshow, will it go automatically go to full screen?
Okay. Yeah, that's fine. That's one of the things I was wondering about is if I could see my notes in presenter view, or if there's not an easy way to do that, but I can do it. I've got notes on paper, so it'll be just fine.
Okay, great.
Okay, good. Okay.
I'm going to jump off here briefly and do a couple of things to get ready. So I'll see you in about 5.
I'll stay here. I've been promoted to panelist. That's never happened to me before. I got skills.
Yes, you should thank the Academy. Welcome, everyone. It looks like we have people streaming in, so I think we'll give it another few minutes before we get started. For those of you who just joined us, we are still allowing people to come into the meeting before we officially get started. We'll do so in 2 minutes. Thank you for your patience. Well, welcome everyone. My name is Sean Hill, and I am the Executive Director of Future West, and we are pleased to have you join us for our webinar, Dutch Solutions for North American Transpo Solutions, or North American Transpo Problems, we have problems here. We're looking for solutions, particularly to the Dutch. So I just want to start out just sort of talking about my experience as living in North America, and living in the Northern Rockies, where we are dealing with all sorts of transportation problems, but the solutions that have been in place for a generation or so are not working. So in North American cities today, particularly in small Rocky Mountain communities like where I live, we feel like we're in the midst of a crisis. Our environment is under threat to real estate development and over-tourism. Affordable housing is scarce, and the traffic volumes we deal with, particularly in peak seasons, are becoming unbearable. So I live in the Jackson Hole area of Idaho and Wyoming. We get about 3 million tourist visits each summer. One day last summer, I was driving on one of the main roads coming out of Jackson Hole during peak season, going in the opposite direction of traffic, thankfully. And I made a mental note of license plates of the cars that comprise the traffic jam. In Idaho and Wyoming, license plates are delineated by county, so we know who's a local and who is not. So I was expecting to find the majority of license plates I was expecting most of them to be out of towners. They were not. Instead, the majority of cars were local. And it was clear that the tourist traffic I had hoped to demonize was actually made up of commuters. All of these cars were local commuters, and they were driving during peak hours. As a local, I knew that if I waited around 6:30 p.m., the roads would be clear. So after doing my count, I came to learn that the Wyoming Department of Transportation has major expansion plans for the road on which I counted license plates. They plan to expand a lovely 2-lane road into a 5-lane highway, and it will cost tens of millions of dollars. And as most of us know, increased road capacity will only induce more traffic and bring in more cars. And all of this, in this example, will occur in Jackson Hole, the center of the greater Yellowstone ecosystem, which is the largest intact ecosystem in a temperate zone on the planet. So why in the world are we expanding roads in this place? Well, as it turns out, to most of us, roads are the only thing we know. Roads are transportation, and transportation is roads. This mindset is not sustainable, and we cannot pave over the places we love, particularly here in the fragile environment of the Rockies. We must change the way we solve transportation problems if we are to coexist with our natural environments and thrive in our built environments. So today, we are pleased to have Zach Vanderkooy, Integrated Mobility Advisor for Mobycon. Mobycon is a transportation firm dedicated to bringing Dutch transportation solutions to the rest of the globe. He works with an international team to bring Dutch policy, planning, and design to North America. Prior to Mobycon, Zach served as Deputy Director for the Vision Zero Network and People for Bikes. He holds a Bachelor of Arts in Government from Cornell and a Master's in Urban Planning from the Harvard University Graduate School of Design. Zach, thanks for joining us.
Thanks, Sean. Yeah, I'm glad to talk with everybody about this. It's my favorite topic. Great. I'm just going to bring up my slides here. Is that looking good in terms of what you guys are seeing in terms of slides?
I do not think we are seeing your slides.
Okay, hold on one second, please. How about now?
There we go.
There we go. Excellent. Yeah, great. Thanks. Like Sean said, my name is Zach. I work for a Dutch, Canadian, US transportation consulting firm called Mobycon. It's a group of about 50 people across 6 different offices, 2 continents that work on planning, engineering, design around basically making communities less dependent on the car. That's been the unifying thread. It's interesting that this firm was founded about 30 years ago, really with a focus on Dutch practice within the Netherlands. And it's only been about the last decade that we've seen this explosion of interest from around the world, and not just the United States and Canada, but everywhere on, we've got some real problems here. can you help us adapt these solutions that have been working in the Netherlands to our context? So our practice has really expanded globally. I work out of our Boulder, Colorado office. We've got a team in Ottawa in Canada, a team in North Carolina as well. I'm really excited about kind of looking at the American West in particular as such a place with great opportunity. When people hear that I work for a Dutch planning firm, they often say, well, you must do a lot with bikes. Like, you know a lot about bikes. That's a Dutch thing. It's true. We do a lot about bikes, and we work with bikes a lot, but not just bikes. And I think, there's a lot of valuable lessons from the Netherlands that other places in the world can take in subjects like safety, in subjects like conservation and climate action, qualities of public space and water management. So the thesis I have, the point I want to try to make is that the bikes in the Netherlands are not really the point. They're kind of a downstream effect of a lot of other planning and policy decisions that have been made over the last 5 decades. Just a little bit more about why I'm here. I live in Colorado, but I have a bit of a unique background into how I came into this world. I have a background in experiential education and knowledge transfer. That's kind of become my specialty, is how do good ideas spread from one place to another through a culture, through a practice, through what are the streams? What can we do if we want to see something happen to accelerate the rate and the quality of change over time? I'm a planner by training, but most of my career has been spent in the nonprofit world, working in transportation and climate policy. So I found that one of the things that I found working in this space is that leadership, vision, and ambition are kind of 3 core ingredients that every community has. Why do some communities make progress quickly while others get stuck? You kind of need those 3 ingredients coming from the highest levels. And we found that one of the best ways to cultivate those ingredients is by bringing people to the Netherlands and spending a week there, riding around on bikes, taking trains, meeting with peers, just fully experiencing this different version of urbanism. So I was able to do that a lot for about a decade, bring hundreds and hundreds of people from the US over time to the Netherlands, spending a week, having this kind of deep interrogation of what cities can be like, the study tour. And it ties very closely into my personal theory of change, which is that you can inject leadership, vision, ambition in a very acupunctural way, almost strategic. So if you just get the right person at the right time in the right town to be very excited, a lot can happen very quickly. It's almost like exploration, right? You get a group of people, kind of traveling to a strange and faraway land, landing in the Netherlands and looking around and saying, whoa, this looks like where I live, but the priorities are certainly different. Take me to your leader. Let's go check it out. That's what the study tour experience is. And this is what it looks like. It's I think in the past decade, we've seen almost an exoticism of Dutch cities, Dutch culture from a transportation and livability standpoint. People are just fascinated by it all over the world. We go there, we take pictures, we look at these strange ways that they design streets and the strange ways that people move around. It's almost like we're looking for solutions at some advanced alien technology that's just beyond our reach. That was how we looked at things about 10, 15 years ago. So a lot of American planners, engineers, designers, politicians had this experience of going and just kind of seeing this different place and saying, there's something to this. I'd say now we're doing it. It's happening. We are very much in the process of adapting Dutch solutions. I want to emphasize too, it's not a copy paste operation. It's not simply a matter of seeing what they do there and us doing it here. We're doing it differently. We need to do it differently for our context, for our cities, for our towns. But we are taking those concepts and ideas and applying them. It's very exciting. We don't have to go to the Netherlands anymore. I mean, it's still great to go if you can. I highly recommend it. But you can see a lot of examples of these kind of advanced ways of solving traffic problems in US cities, even now. So today, what I want to do, talk for about 20 minutes, then we'll get into hopefully a really good discussion about this topic. But first, I want to just kind of rewind a bit on the Dutch experience. What really happened there to produce the solutions that we see today? And then really the whole time I'm talking about this, I'm thinking about what are the parallels to our situation right now? What are the lessons that we can take? What are the lessons that we can't take? And we need to figure out how to do things differently in our way. Then I want to pivot to looking specifically at some of the North American adaptations that are underway, particularly a mountain town in Alberta that has done some really great work in the last few years. I want to kind of highlight some of their version of solving some of these traffic issues that Sean talked about in the introduction from a North American perspective. So I'm going to skip past the part where I spend a lot of time explaining why the Netherlands is a global leader in quality of life. Depending on, whatever metrics you look at, whatever kind of rankings you look at, you'll see, examples of one of the top countries in the world for happiness, for safety, for wealth, for social equity, for conservation, for climate. It's a great place to be. Even if happy kids aren't really your thing, you'll find that even the World Economic Forum thinks the Netherlands is a great place to be a driver. It just is an objective leader in a lot of these metrics that we use to measure how good is it to be a human in this place. It's very easy and very tempting, and I felt this way at first when I first started getting into this. That, well, yeah, of course it's different. It's it's Europe. They've got tiny streets everywhere. It's always been this way. It's totally different. But that's actually not true. It really wasn't always this way. The story I want to share is one of a generation-long project that started in the night after the World War II in the 1950s, that led directly to the country we see today, where all of these ideas are now being adapted, imported, exported, and looked at from around the world as solutions to 2022 problems. So after World War II, big changes in the Netherlands. There was a surge in private wealth. People were doing better. There was a lot of interest in moving beyond the traumas of World War II. And planners, thinkers were heavily influenced by modernists around the world, the Robert Moseses of the world. The future very much was the car. And there was a lot of concern in very old medieval cities like Amsterdam that, whoa, we're going to be left behind in this new global economy if we don't have a modern city. So from the 60s on, you saw a really rapid spike in the amount of cars in Dutch cities. This isn't only big cities like Amsterdam, but smaller towns, cities like Rotterdam, industrial cities that sustained heavy damage during World War II, and were now kind of being reconsidered and rebuilt in a new form, and a lot of discussions were happening. But by the late 60s, this was becoming a real problem and it wasn't just a convenience problem of having cities clogged with cars. It was deadly, a significant safety problem. You see the rise in traffic deaths was substantial in the 20 years after the war. And this, interestingly, we're experiencing a surge in the US right now. Traffic deaths rose, I think, at a higher rate in the past year than they did in the previous 16. Not quite this dramatic, but we're definitely on the wrong trajectory in terms of safety. And this isn't only talking about pedestrians and bikes, but people in cars too. So this captured the attention. And what I want to do now is point to, I think, 3 converging crises that were happening at this time that led to the transformation in the Netherlands that we see in the streets today. The first was this safety problem, a very emotional campaign, Stop the Kindermoord, which literally kind of means stop the child murder, was a significant part of the movement in the Netherlands around safety. This kind of came from the bottom up. It was largely grassroots, but there was a really key historical moment that often gets glossed over, which is that a prominent journalist in the Netherlands had a child who was killed in traffic. And this is back in a time when prominent journalists had a lot of influence over cultural issues and kind of what people were thinking about and talking about. I think that kind of combination of rising grassroots from as well as this particular cultural influencer and just right place at the right time made this a significant movement. And what the result was actual policy, a true national safety strategy that was revised and improved over the decades, but came out of this problem, and that influenced the design of every street in the country going forward. Believe it or not, in the US, we really didn't have a national safety strategy until very recently. We'll get to that later. Crisis 2 was the global oil shortage. This has affected the whole world, and it affected the Netherlands even more than other places because it's a country that has no domestic oil production. The result of this, the response to this, was some pretty severe hardships and some pretty severe restrictions on driving, including car-free Sundays. So a complete, in certain cities and highways and regions, ban on private car use on Sundays. Certainly had a big impact on the culture, but one of the outcomes of this was that people got to experience streets in a totally different way and take ownership of public space in a way that they may not have had the opportunity to before. People realize that this is actually, there are some benefits to this, even though there's a lot of problems with it as well. But that was kind of how the national response to that went. This had a big influence on a lot of people who grew up in this era. Third crisis of the time was around housing and urban renewal and neighborhood development. So this was a pretty contentious time in the country. There were protests, demonstrations, riots, some of them even violent, largely around preservation of neighborhoods and housing. There were a lot of plans to demolish older buildings, create newer, modern fabric in the cities. What the result of this movement was to kind of pause on that, slow that down, just kind of get people to say, well, wait a minute, maybe we don't need to build highways through our cities to be a modern city. It at least kind of put the brakes on this very fast forward vision toward a modern city. None of these people were talking directly about bikes or cars or trains. They were talking about quality of life in all three of these cases with the crisis. But I think, what is the legacy of this? How did it influence policy going forward? All of these people with long hair and mustaches, what did they do? They basically gave people an ownership of the streets, so that people came first. It kind of inverted the modal hierarchy. So here we have a Dutch city from the early 1980s, where it looks pretty similar to what we would see in an American or Canadian city. Here's that same city now. Really, it's just inverting the hierarchy. It's saying, well, people come first. The red coloring is a bike. You'll notice this isn't a place that says no cars. Cars are actually permitted to go here. They're just asked to be guests. They are not at the top of the hierarchy pyramid. They're just, they're allowed to go there where they need to for deliveries, for those sorts of things. But it's just a philosophy, a change in philosophy, responding to all three of those crises. Here's another one. Again, relatable to us today, maybe to a main street or a downtown in a mountain community. A lot of car parking. It doesn't look that different from what you'd see right now. Here's the same thing, but without the car parking, and it actually feels like a radically different place. So, what happens when you remove car parking? Do the shops lose customers and go away? Well, some of them might, depending on what their business is, but for the most part, this is a healthier, more pleasant place. And this is not a special place or a special street. This is just an average, typical street that you'd see really anywhere in the country. So I think the takeaway, the point from this is, this took a long time. It was 50 years in the making. It wasn't just a one and done thing. There's been a lot of iteration, changes, studies, research, improvements. The practice has evolved a lot over those 50 years, but it kind of started from that particular period, that unique period where there was a opportunity, the good timing, for those social changes to happen that led to changes in how we do streetscapes and mobility. Really, the point here is that, we look at Netherlands and say, well, we're not like them. They're very different. And I think if you talk to the people in the 70s, they would say the same thing about Amsterdam in the 1970s versus today. Amsterdam wasn't Amsterdam either until it was. So that's all good, exciting, fun stuff. But what I really want to get into here is what are the lessons? What does that mean for us? Like what are the adaptations and what do we take away from this? I want to zoom in on Canmore, Alberta. Here we are about 50 miles west of Calgary in the foothills of the Canadian Rockies on the eastern slope, a town that has a very about 16,000 people and a very robust tourism economy. A lot of culture of conservation, recreation, and big traffic problems. Very relatable I think, to how Sean described the Jackson region. Canmore went, they had a lot of introspection over the past decade. They had some really good people on their city council, some leadership that just sort of led a conversation about, well, what do we want our community to be? Like, not, oh my gosh, this street is really congested, let's go solve that problem. But let's kind of pause and step back for a moment and say, what do we want Canmore to be? It all starts with a really good plan. And this is really important. I think it's a step that gets undervalued a lot in US practice. They started by looking at their entire street network and saying, what is the function of each of these streets? And then using Dutch inspiration, created kind of a very simple, clear matrix that says, if we're going to have a street that does this, this is how it should be designed. They started at that level rather than kind of looking at, here's the problem spots, let's address those. This is not easy. It's very difficult to do because it forces you to have conversations about trade-offs. Not every street can be a great street for moving through. Not every street can be a great street for staying in. It kind of forces you to make decisions about hierarchy in a really clear, simple way. And that's kind of one of the things that the Dutch practice does very, very well. And Canmore has looked at that as a model and tried to make it their own. So what this does too is it gets us out of a conversation about this street versus this intersection, a project by project dialogue, and instead makes the conversation about the whole network, which is going to be really important for those political challenges that are going to come up with every project. So here is what they looked at for inspiration for Spring Creek Drive, one of their kind of minor arterials in town. They looked at self-enforcing and intuitive design. This is what works so well about that clear hierarchy. This is a 50 kilometers per hour street, and it's very clear. You don't see a lot of speed limit signs on this street because it's, unless you're an expert, professional driver, physically very difficult to actually drive faster than the allowed speed limit on this street. Looking at the width of the lanes, the markings on the pavement, it's a principle that a street should essentially, regulate and force itself. This is Canmore's version of that. This is kind of what they took that inspiration and applied it. You notice they also used kind of the red coloring to help highlight differences in separation of modes. So red for bike space, the gray for pedestrian space, and then keeping the car traffic flowing as well. There's a lot of details I could point out here around how they handle the crossings and the intersections that really tell people using the road how to behave and where they're expected to behave without actually telling them through signage. Noticing on this red cycle path on the right here, how it raises up to the sidewalk level. So if you're riding a bike along this street, you're staying at the same grade the entire time. Whereas if you're driving a car, you're going to be rising up to cross over that grade and then dropping back down on the other side. That's another really key kind of self-enforcing, self-explanatory Dutch technique as to say who has priority. And you don't need a lot of signs that say yield to bikes. It's saying the physical design itself is telling you what the expected behavior is. This is not a particularly intuitive street. This is a strode. Term comes from Strong Towns, from Charles Marone. Very common type of street. We see this in urban and suburban settings in the US and Canada, everywhere. Every town has something that looks like this. Because it's confusing, because it mixes so many different elements from that matrix that I showed of what type of road is this? How fast is it supposed to go? Is it a place for moving through, or is it a place for staying in? This type of road is not only confusing and stressful to use, it's actually very dangerous. In fact, it's the most dangerous kind of road. So how else, besides clear hierarchy, the other really strong Dutch lesson that Canmore took in their work was traffic calming, and that's speed management. That means that you don't have to ban cars. You can allow cars in a lot of places. You just have to calm them, to tame them, to put them at a speed that's appropriate and safe for the neighborhood. Dutch cities really do traffic calming. We do traffic calming too. They do it very hardcore. They will make it so that there is no physical way that you can really operate a car in a dangerous way on a street. There's a lot of examples of this. We have some pretty good resources in the US for this now. We still have a lot of this too. This isn't really traffic calming. This is a lot of telling people what to do with signs, but the design of the road is telling them to do something different. And that's creating confusion. That's not working. So the lesson here is you've got to change the physical street to actually change behavior. Policy is important, clarity is important, but it really comes down to making the street self-enforcing. Doesn't have to be complicated. I imagine some of you have seen this picture before, but traffic calming is just a big rock in the road, and strategically placed. It can be beautiful, it can be expensive, or it can be really simple. I don't necessarily recommend literally putting rocks in the road, but it actually works. That's all it is. It's psychology. So here's Canmore again. This is a slightly different spot in that same street that we looked at before. Pay attention to this manhole cover here, right in the center. And look at what they've done with that. So there it is behind that bollard. They've significantly reduced the amount of space on the road and significantly increased the amount of space for people on bikes, walking, and whatever other form of rolling. But it still works very well for all modes. Part of their network, because they had that network plan, because they looked at every single street and they said, this is a street where we can really prioritize people on bikes. The next street over, not so much, but this is the one where we're going to do it. And it made sense within their network context. Here's another one from Canmore that I really like to look at. This is actually one of the major arterials in town. It's one of their busiest, kind of highest volume capacity streets, where they were having a lot of congestion issues related to, people just using. So they had two goals here. They wanted to modernize the intersection, make it safe for people on bikes, walking and all that, but they also really wanted to retain capacity for cars because they didn't want to make congestion problems worse. So how do you do that? That's another area that is a challenge for a lot of cities. Here's that intersection now. They did a North American adaptation of a Dutch style intersection, which is keeping the bikes and the pedestrians totally separated from the turning cars. They've adjusted the turn radius on this curb to make it so that it's very physically difficult to take that turn at a speed that is dangerous, at least a lot more difficult than it was in the before configuration. They've actually shrunk the size of the road quite a bit. But what they haven't done is lost any capacity. They've made the traffic work more efficiently, but just with better design. They've introduced some things that were kind of innovative, kind of radical, that were actually not easy to do because they weren't part of the manuals. Some traffic signals on the near side, which is a Dutch practice. So putting the signal on the side of the road where the car is waiting rather than on the opposite side of the street. A lot of little details here. And the important thing here is that this was not just done once, and left alone. They've been monitoring it very closely, making small adjustments to the signal timing, to the design tweaks. This is a, you got to kind of look at this like with the lab coat. This is kind of an experiment. We've got to really look at it closely, see how it's operating, and then figure out ways to optimize it. But pretty impressive what they've done there. They've still got a long ways to go. I want to kind of wrap us up here with a little bit of optimism, and hopefully we can get into the discussion about a lot of these things. The three crises in the Netherlands, the safety crisis, the oil crisis, the housing crisis, that kind of all came together at the same time. And I see a lot of parallels between that time and on the US today. We were looking at our own oil crisis. We certainly have a safety crisis. As Sean was mentioning, housing, land use, it all ties into transportation. This is a proclamation from Secretary Buttigieg around a national safety strategy. It's something that has really emerged in the last 6 months. This is, believe it or not, the first time that our national highest levels of leadership have actually said, yeah, we're not going to have any deaths in traffic. This is the target. This is our intent. There's no reason to do this. So how it affects us is yet to be seen, but I can see a lot of signs of positive momentum that we may be on a path to finally getting some of these things ingrained in our practice and our culture. So with that, I think I'll wrap it up, and I'll let Sean and Randy take us to the next part.
Great, thanks, Zach. Very fascinating. One thing I want to make sure everyone is aware of is that Mobycon has an online tool called Street Sketch that allows you to drag and drop street elements and customize them to a street that you may be working with. And I just wanted to share, and Zach, I think I just need to reclaim my hosting duties. But so I'm from Salt Lake City, and Salt Lake City, the streets there are notoriously wide because back in the day, the city fathers thought it was of utmost importance that an ox train be able to make a full U-turn without having to rehitch. I don't know why they couldn't go around the block, but nevertheless, we have extremely wide streets in Salt Lake City. And this is a photo of State Street in Salt Lake City. And then I just want to show you obviously that is just a really wide and brutal, hostile street for bikes and peds. And it's not very attractive. And it also has, it has a large landscape impact. So this is a view from a hill above the city. And you have the Wasatch Range and then this valley floor that is just carpeted with trees. And then you have State Street and then a companion street, Main Street, running the length of the valley, creating this asphalt scar in this beautiful place. And so using Mobycon's Street Sketch tool, I was able to come up with something that was where I was using the same right-of-way width, but instead I made it more park-like because I wanted to not only make the street more pedestrian friendly, but because I also wanted to allow for that green canopy to stretch over the scar along the valley. And not to get too much into my design here, but I made Main Street one way and State Street one way as well. I even added a tram line, and there's just so much room for bike lanes and trees and people. And it just, using this tool was really fascinating for me, just because you really see the potential that North American cities have when they rethink their streets. And instead of considering them streets, if we think of them as public spaces, the opportunities are endless. So very cool tool. It's at Mobycon's website. I encourage you all to use it. So let's, oops. So why don't we go to Q&A, and let's start with, we have a discussion going here where Stefan Baer has basically acknowledged that Dutch transportation is, is something we would all aspire to, but did the Netherlands have to deal with strip malls and massive office towers and other things that have come to characterize the North American landscape? So is that something that they had to overcome, Zach?
Yes, there's definitely a big land use component to this story. One of the outcomes of the housing crisis, the housing demonstrations, movements of the 1970s, were some pretty big changes to national land use law. And this is something that I want to point out too, that the Netherlands is a small country, physically and culturally, they do national land use planning, like to a very detailed level. So, I mean, it's, if you're in a municipality in the Netherlands, you can't, you want to build a new neighborhood or new suburb, that comes from the national top-down level. So that's one thing they do pretty differently from us. And I bring that up not to be discouraging, but just to point out that the scale there is quite a bit different than we're used to working in. But one of the outcomes of those 1970s movements was land use legislation that had to do with the size and scale of shopping and access to shopping. So for probably not even intentionally, but the building of like big box retail is much more difficult there. It does exist, but it's far less common and prevalent than it is here. And that was one of those downstream results of that decision that was made a generation ago, in that it's a lot easier to kind of maintain the human scale in a lot of development today. So, there's probably not a direct lesson there other than, do good land use planning. But yeah, they have had to overcome those challenges, but not in the same way that we do.
Great. And then just a clarifying note here. For those that who want to ask questions, use the Q&A dialogue as others have been doing. And so with that, I'm going to go on to another question from Stefan. Is there any documented benefit of near side versus far side signal placement?
I wish my colleague Wayne, who's an engineer, were here, because that'd be the kind of thing he'd love to answer. I know it's such a new practice in North America that I don't know that we have a lot of extensive data on it. I do know that it's a standard practice in the Netherlands for one main reason, which is that it makes it strongly discourages cars from encroaching into crosswalks when they're waiting at red lights. Another big difference is that, right turns on red are not a standard practice in the Netherlands either. They're allowed in certain cases, but it's the exception, not the norm. So the main reason why they do the signals on the near side is to keep cars waiting in the appropriate place at signalized intersections.
Great, thank you. Heidi has a question. How does the U.S. federal transportation policy and funding help or hinder implementing these types of projects?
That's a good question. So a lot of the leadership in some of these innovative things that we don't normally do, ideas coming from the Netherlands, like near side signals, like protected bike lanes, that has largely been led at the local level by municipalities and to a lesser extent MPOs. And that's because the pipeline for using federal money is long and generally isn't well set up for smaller scale projects. So I'd say most of this stuff is done with local money, local leadership. But I think that's changing and improving. I think there's a new grant program from the Federal Highway Administration, the Safe Streets for All grant program, SS4A, that directly ties to the most recent infrastructure law that was passed in January, I believe. And that is a direct federal to local grant program to implement safety related projects. So I think with the current administration, we're seeing a lot more recognition that we need to be a lot more nimble at getting money where it needs to go. But yeah, still a long way to go there. It's really it's been very locally led up to this point.
Zach, I'm going to jump in. I have to ask this question because I am presented with this all the time. But when you implement these solutions in North America, what do you do with all the snow?
Yeah, good question. The answer is you maintain it just like you would any other transportation facility. And what does that mean? Well, it means sometimes you might have to change your maintenance practices. Sometimes you might need to reevaluate the fleet. But really, that's less of a technical challenge than it is a leadership challenge. It's just a matter of prioritizing. What are you going to maintain and how are you going to do it? A lot of cities have struggled with this with some of their protected bike lanes where there's an actual physical barrier between the car lane and the bike lane, and how do you get snowplows in there? And the answer in most cases is you get a different snowplow, which is an investment up front, but not one that should prevent you from doing good infrastructure.
Great. Let's go to a question from Jacob. Jacob says, I have heard that some Dutch cities improve their urban settings with noise ordinances and street designs intended to reduce traffic noise. Have any cities in North America successfully created enforceable noise ordinances or intentionally designed streets to reduce traffic volume? Thanks.
That's a great question. I don't know of any North American communities that have explicitly done traffic related decisions based on noise pollution. But I would love to see that. And maybe someone else in the chat or the audience does know of that. Because yeah, I don't have a good answer for that, but I love the idea.
Yeah. All right. We have someone asking, first stating that, and I quote, our city may want to be better, but our state is not supportive. Are there ways to sneak in positive changes without having to change the minds of state DOT planners?
Yeah, very, very relatable question to a lot of people in a lot of states, I think. Are there ways to sneak in? Well, you know, I'll use an example from a little more than a decade ago, but New York City was one of the early adopters, kind of early leaders of some of these things like protected bike lanes that were not really part of any current, federal design guidance. And the state DOT in New York was a pretty big obstacle to this early on. In that case, New York City is New York City. They were able to just say, we're just doing it anyway. So that's one path forward, is just plowing through, but that takes a lot of political courage to do. I think finding the people in that ecosystem of leadership in the state DOT that have the ability to influence that are really important. And sometimes it's not an overnight thing, but it's kind of cultivating that vision and leadership together. So relationship building is really important. Bring your state DOT leaders to the Netherlands for a week. That'll do the job. But if that's not possible, yeah, I think it's just a matter of slowly building trust, finding small projects that kind of move toward where you want to get to. But yeah, no easy answer there. It's just leadership. You can, if there are particular people, usually I find in this kind of situation, there's often like one or two people that are just kind of the barrier. You can wait for them to retire or you can, find ways around them. But
yeah, I mean, an anecdote that I'll share here is that I was working with a city in Idaho, and the city wanted to install a parklet on a state highway. And the Idaho Transportation Department head, the regional head, was absolutely not. The road is for cars, it's for the safety of cars. And so we pushed back a little bit, and me and the project architect ended up driving 2 hours away to the regional headquarters. And we sat across the table from like 8 burly dudes with their arms crossed. And we just talked it through with them. We mentioned another city in Idaho that had gone rogue and put in the parklet, and it had been there for like 3 years, and there had been no problems. They're like, oh, what? We better check that out. Well, they did, and they saw that it was no problem. And then they came back to us and they said, all right, you've got our approval. So I think it's just like Zach said, it's about personal relationships as much as it is policy.
And I think travel is one of the best tools for unlocking that. It doesn't necessarily mean going to another country. It can be the next town over, but sometimes just seeing someone, a town or a city community that you consider a peer, seeing that no one wants to be the first one to do anything, but everyone wants to be the second or the third. So yeah, sometimes just getting out of your own, limited municipal bubble can be really helpful for those kinds of problems.
We have a question from Mark. He says, are there any shortcomings with the Dutch approaches that could possibly be done better in the US or Canada?
Definitely. Yeah. I don't think that the Netherlands has figured everything out perfectly, even for their own system. And, we need to do things our way here. I think, there's speed. The rate of implementation is one of the biggest areas that we can improve. It took them 50 plus years, an entire generation of work with lots of iterations and changes. We don't have the luxury of having 50 years. We need to make a lot of these changes a lot quicker than that if we're going to make a dent in safety problems and climate problems. So I think that's a big area where we can iterate on, is in rapid implementation. And I think we do a lot of things really well in that area that I think even some Dutch municipalities could learn from us in terms of pilot projects, demonstration projects, kind of going from idea to implementation relatively quickly. So I think that's definitely where we need to focus on, is urgency.
Okay. So we have another question. Some of the biggest opponents of these types of projects are emergency responders because they feel they can't get their large vehicles where they need to be. Do you have good examples of getting their support?
Yes. And this is very similar to the maintenance question, because if a public works department says, well, we can't build that because we can't maintain it, what they're really saying is, we don't want to prioritize it, or we don't have the resources to do it. And so, it's kind of similar with emergency responders. They need to be able to, get to where they're going as fast as possible. But if the fire truck doesn't fit in the new road design, is that the problem of the fire truck, or is that the problem of the road? In other words, do you design your city to match your fleet, or do you design your fleet to match your city? Fortunately, there's been a big improvement in availability in the last 5 years of different types and scales of emergency responder vehicles. So part of it is a longer term project of just getting the right equipment to match the infrastructure, which is not, I understand, not easy, not free. But a lot of it too is leadership. The fire department works for the mayor, works for the government. Like it's really needing that top-down vision and leadership that says, yes, we understand what we're doing. That there are trade-offs, there are decisions that need to be made at every level. But this is important because this is important for safety reasons, for climate reasons, for mobility reasons. That's what we're doing. So it's kind of just a top-down decision in most cases, if that's a problem. Doesn't mean that emergency responders don't have a really important role in street design, and that their needs definitely need to be accounted for. But you have to kind of balance, make choices, and you need strong leadership to do that.
Yeah. We have another question from Stefan, and this is getting very specific about the Canmore project. So Stefan says, I noticed on the Spring Creek Drive example that there were no tactile warning strips across the local intersections. Why were they omitted? I saw that there were tactile warning strips though on the Railway Avenue intersection upgrades, seeing as pedestrians need to drop down into the road. Also, why were there no tactile warning strips across the cycling infrastructure?
Yeah, let me answer that.
Well enough. That's a very detailed look at your work there.
If you want, I could share my screen and I can pull up the image that I think Stefan is asking about, and we can look at it together. Just want to give me access to that.
Yeah, just a second. Okay.
Okay, so I think this is the one we're asking about. If not, let me know. But yeah, so this is getting into some really technical discussions around accessibility and warning strips, and I'm American, so I don't know the Canadian version of accessibility law that well. But I believe the texture that's used with those pavers is meant to be a form of tactile warning, where it kind of it changes from the curb to the sidewalk, and it's a very soft curb to sidewalk transition. But those rough pavers are meant to create a rough transition. How that actually complies with Canadian law, I don't actually know that. We need the engineers from Canmore to come on to answer that. I believe, is that the street you were talking about? I think it is.
He says that's the one.
Yeah.
Cool. Well, all right. I think I have just one more question, and I don't know if you're able to answer this, Zach, but something that we run into a lot is the fact that cars pay registration fees, gas tax, whatever. Cyclists don't. So who's going to pay for all of this if we don't have a built-in revenue stream?
Yeah, fair question. Yeah, and I mean, my answer to that depends community to community, kind of what their priorities are, but it basically comes down to usually is you can't really afford not to do this, because the tangible costs of car dependence are enormous and only likely to get higher. So you know there's a lot of kind of economics around cost benefit analysis, and you can kind of look at the societal level and the individual level, sort of what do you get by investing in active transportation. And you know, no matter how you look at it, it always comes out as a really net positive social investment, even if you're not someone who uses that facility at all. It does. So like from a bigger social picture, it's cheap stuff. But I understand in the American context, that's a harder argument to make because we're not really used to thinking that way. We're much more of a what's in it for me kind of culture. So yeah, I mean, the short answer is, you know, yeah, it's real. It's cost money. You know, you've got to invest in it and maintain it and promote it, just like any other form of infrastructure. But compared to the costs of road widening and kind of trying to solve traffic congestion in a whack-a-mole way, it's an absolute bargain.
Yeah. Well, great. Well, I think we should end it there. And thank you, Zach. This has been a fascinating presentation. And thank you everyone for attending. Now, remember, this webinar is eligible for 1 AICP CM credit. And so if you go to APA's website and search for Dutch solutions for North American transportation problems, you should be able to find the page where you can add this credit. Also, we are recording this session, and so we will post this webinar to Future West's website. And finally, I also want to make everyone aware that Future West will hold another transportation webinar on July 20th. We will feature transportation planner Don Kostelek, who will show us how to get real about the costs of roads and why they cost taxpayers so much, why it's getting worse, and how local residents can lead the change to a smarter, more convenient 21st transportation system. A smarter, more convenient system like those that we have seen today. So be sure to tune in to that. Again, a big thank you to our speaker, Zach. And again, thank you for everyone for attending, and have a great post-solstice and great summer. Thanks, everyone.